Welcome, my friends, to another edition of More Bad News, brought to you as always by Camel Cigarettes. Take the Camels Challenge, smoke Camels for 30 days, and see for yourself why so many Americans would walk a mile for Camels. This week, I wanted to do something a little different, and I hope it works. In the past videos, I was presenting material that I used in lectures, but this week I found something in my notes which captured my attention, and I would like to share it with you. It's an essay, Jane Franklin Macomb, a Boston woman in revolutionary times, by Jeremy Stern, who at the time was a graduate student at Princeton University. The essay was published in Early American Studies, an interdisciplinary journal, in 2006. The essay is about Jane Franklin, the youngest daughter of Josiah Franklin. Her older brother was Benjamin Franklin, but other than that, she was a very ordinary woman struggling to survive, and her story gives us a very interesting glimpse into the American Revolution. Jane Franklin Macomb was the youngest sister of Benjamin Franklin. She was not in any respects overtly extraordinary. As a widowed, middle-aged woman in Boston struggling to keep herself afloat with a small business and often dependent upon charity of her relations, she must have been typical of many women who faced the revolutionary crisis and engaged with it in their own way. She was intelligent and interested in the world and read often. In these things, too, there is no reason to believe that she was exceptional. But Jane Macomb was remarkable in one important respect. Because of her brother, many of her letters were saved, and she gives voice to a largely voiceless element in colonial New England, allowing us an insight into a largely lost experience of America's founding era. She was, by the standards of her day, already in old age when the imperial crisis began. Her husband was soon dead and her children were grown. Her aim during the war was to successfully support herself. Her aim before the war was to successfully support herself as a widow. The revolution and war undermined and then violently uprooted her way of life. Her aim was to survive. That must have been typical for many of the women of advancing age and poor economic prospects, women whose lives left little trace in the historical record. Jane Franklin was born in March 27, 1712, the last of Josiah Franklin's 17 children. She had an elementary education and she could both read newspapers and books. It is clear that she and her brother remained deeply bound to each other. They had a lot of affection for each other. Benjamin stole away from Boston to Philadelphia when Jane was only 11, and yet in a letter when he was 21, he wrote that she was ever his peculiar favorite. Jane married Edward Macomb, a Boston saddler who was never successful in business, just shortly after her 15th birthday. And the couple ended up living in Jane's parents' house. And before long, she was taking in boarders to pay expenses. And she would continue to take lodgers for decades. Often, they provided most of her meager income. Although 3 of her children died in infancy, she had 9 more. Jane's family was not destined to thrive, however, and her life gradually descended into a litany of tragedy, misfortune, and loss. Even as a young woman, she saw most of her siblings die. 13 of Josiah Franklin's 17 children had been alive when she was a child. By 1731, there were 7, and by 1763, 3 were left. After her brother Peter died in 1766, only Benjamin and Jane were left, and Benjamin was far away. He wrote to her that their affection should increase as their numbers diminish, and she replied in 1766, reminding him that you and I are now the only ones left, but her affection had no room for increase. Yet Jane and Benjamin saw each other only infrequently. Starting in the 1750s, Franklin was mostly spending his time in London. Jane was left largely on her own to nurse her parents through their final illnesses. They at least died in advanced age. Her children were another matter. By 1762, Jane began to keep a book of ages to record the births and deaths in her family. The deaths grew with melancholy steadiness. By 1765, 3 of her 9 children who had survived infancy had died, along with several grandchildren. Her eldest surviving son, Edward, died in 1758. Ebenezer followed in 1762. Between 1764 and March 1765, she lost her daughter Sarah and two of Sarah's four children. Of those children still living, two could give their mother little comfort. Peter Franklin Macomb began to show signs of mental illness, and by 1763, his insanity had progressed, and he had to be sent to the country to be looked after, and her brother, Benjamin, paid for his support. Jane's son, Benny, proved also to be a spectacular disaster. Ambitious to become a printer, Franklin had set him up with opportunities which he squandered in New York, Antigua, and Boston. By 1765, he was showing himself also to show erratic and troubling behavior, and he would show signs of mental instability as well. There can be little question that the family crisis dominated Jane's life in the 1760s, but she was not oblivious to the rising troubles in the colony's public life as well. First, the French and Indian War you couldn't ignore. It was impoverishing the city of Boston and draining it of its men. And certainly she followed her brother's career closely. During legislative sessions, out-of-town members of the House of Representatives lodged in her boarding house, and it would be hard for her not to be able to listen to the opinions of the men arguing around her table. It was in 1765 that public affairs explicitly entered Jane's correspondence with her brother. Despite her recent personal tragedies, the Stamp Act crisis sharply engaged her attention. Jane emphatically disapproved of the Stamp Act, even admitting that there had never been anything that gave me so great a shock as seeing that your friend John Hughes was appointed stamp master in Philadelphia. I fear that his appointment was by your means, which in fact it was. Franklin was still carefully working the ropes of patronage and influence in London, and his opposition to the ministerial measures had not yet fully gelled. But Jane's principal concern was plainly the maintenance of order, a priority which she clung to with growing desperation in the coming years. She was particularly moved and appalled by the suffering of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, whose New England home, beautiful home on the North End, only half a mile from her boarding house, had been destroyed by a mob August 26, 1765. At the height of the Stamp Act crisis, barely 2 weeks after August 26th riots that so upset Jane, her husband died. She wrote to her brother, "In 15 months, I have been bereaved of 4 near and dear relatives." A stunned Jane wrote to Franklin's wife, Deborah. Just as she had been shocked by the abuse heaped upon Hutchinson, she was also troubled by the attacks on her brother, whose Philadelphia home was also threatened by a mob. Slanderers against her brother fueled her own depression. Among her lodgers, she wrote, "I have 6 good, honest souls, representatives from outside of Boston, who come groaning home day by day at the stupidity of their brethren." By November 1766, she was attempting to start a small business, ordering fabrics and English fashions through Franklin's London landlady to sell it to Boston ladies. Her goods arrived in May 1767, but tragedy never seemed to be far removed from Jane. Even as she readied her goods for sale, word came from Nantucket that her daughter Polly, visiting relatives, had fallen ill and died at age 19. In a letter she wrote, "Sorrows roll upon me like the waves of the sea. I am hardly allowed time to fetch my breath. I am broken with breach upon breach, and I have now, in the first flow of my grief, been almost ready to say, 'What have I more?' But God is sovereign, and I must submit." As if to mock Jane's remaining hope, even as she struggled with this catastrophic loss, political forces now conspired to strangle her meager fledgling trade. In September 1767, word reached Boston of the Townshend Acts, and in late October, the town meetings voted to recommend non-importation. The very items that Jane was now trying to sell were being boycotted. It would not have been possible to choose a worse moment for her venture. But troubles rarely came singly to Jane. In May, Deborah, Franklin's wife, who lived in Philadelphia, wrote that Benny had arrived in Philadelphia with his wife and 5 children. Her son Benny arrived in Philadelphia at Franklin's wife's home with his 5 kids. Franklin wrote to his wife, "I hope they do not hang upon you, for really, as we grow older, we grow more helpless, and we shall find ourselves with nothing to spare." His fears were justified because soon Franklin's illegitimate son, William, the governor of New Jersey, wrote that cousin Ben is starving in Philadelphia, and only Deborah and William's aid were keeping them alive. William railed at Benny's pride and laziness and concluded, "I look upon him to have a tincture of madness." Benny, like his brother Peter before him, was losing his reason. And that was not the end of Jane's troubles. William told his father that John Meekham, the third of Jane's 4 surviving sons, had turned out as bad as Ben and had gone and quartered himself and his wife on his mother in Boston, a financial strain that she could ill afford. William sent Jane barrels of flour to help her cope. As if the destruction of her tiny business and the growing disasters of her children were not enough, the growing Townsend crisis now cost Jane another of her slim means of support. In June 1768, the Massachusetts court dissolved and she lost her lodgers. In December, the famous destruction of the tea occurred in the Boston harbor. By September 1774, Franklin was worried that his correspondence with Jane was being intercepted. Of late, the seals in her letters were routinely broken, and he was not certain that his letters were reaching her. Boston was now a grim place. Parliament had closed the port of Boston until the destroyed tea was paid for, and a new governor, General Thomas Gage, had again garrisoned the troops with soldiers. Near Jane's home, a drunken soldier invaded a shop, breaking and smashing the owner's goods with a bayonet and crying out that he would kill every inhabitant he met, and insisting that his commander had given him leave to take anything he wanted from any house in town. A fight ensued, and the shop's owner and his servants were badly hurt before an officer and guard arrived to remove the soldier. "This," she said, "has made me afraid what may be before the winter is out," she confessed. "My only comfort is God reigns." In April, open war erupted at Lexington and Concord. The Massachusetts militia pursued the Boston forces back to Boston, and the town prepared for a siege. Jane was forced to flee the community where she had lived her entire life. At 63, Jane became a refugee of the war. Jane now had to survive the war, no small task. The war years preyed heavily on Jane's remaining family. Her son Josiah enlisted in the Massachusetts Regiment in May 1775 and died shortly before Bunker Hill of disease from Army camp life. Benny, meanwhile, had declined into insanity. Shortly after the Battle of Trenton, he wandered off and was never heard from again. Jane's last remaining son, the insane Peter, added no comfort. His death in 1779 relieved her of this perpetual anxiety. Jane had, quote, "still retained for him the affection of a parent, but she admitted that his death was a release. He has been no comfort to anyone, nor capable of enjoying any himself for many years." This left only one of Jane's 12 children, her daughter Jenny, and their relationship was heavily strained. Despite the losses and troubles of the war that the war inflicted upon her, Jane remained unshaken in her patriotism and support for the struggle. When her brother informed her that the French alliance in 1778, Jane declared, "Thank God, I hope that we now may be restored to peace on our own equitable terms of independence." In May of the same year, Jane joined Catherine Green in making ruffled shirts and stockings for the soldiers who were in great want and could not get enough supplies to them. In 1780, Jane enthusiastically praised the ladies and noble generous subscription for the army begun in Philadelphia and wished that she could do the same. She concluded that it would be impractical in her neighborhood, lacking as it was in wealth, unless a hearty goodwill in me would effect it. In October 1781, she rejoiced in the glorious news that we have now received from the southward, the American victory at Yorktown. She had survived 7 years of war and flight. Benjamin Franklin died in 1790. After that final sorrow, Jane's correspondence all but stopped. She herself died in May 1794 at the age of 82. Her burial place is unknown. Only one of her 12 children survived her. Her experience of displacement, danger, loss, and the quest for a semblance of an old life must represent a host of other poor women who left little or no trace of their existence and experience. Indeed, it may be mainly in her survival that Jane proved exceptional. Without an extraordinary character and determination, and without the good fortune of a financially comfortable brother ready and willing to extend her support, her such a story might have ended differently. Perhaps in the end, Jane Makeham's story should stand as a monument to the many like her who were still less fortunate. Well, that's it for this week. I will be back next week, hopefully, with another edition of More Bad News.